Today I'm going to show you what's inside of the Chrysler Pentastar engine and how it works. Now the Pentastar is a series of V6 engine. This is the more popular 3.6 liter V6 engine out of a 2018 Jeep Wrangler. Now in that vehicle it's situated longitudinally for rear wheel drive, as it also is in the Ram trucks and the Jeep Grand Cherokee. However, this is literally the Dodge Caravan of engines because it's been used in a Dodge Caravan as well as the Challenger and Charger. Taking a quick look around here, you can see we've got the air intake over here that leads to a plastic intake manifold, which is going to take it down to the two heads on either side. And we do have aluminum head and an aluminum block over here, and the camshaft is driven by timing chains behind this timing cover. Looking around the right side here, we've got clear access to the spark plugs on this side, but like with any V6 engine, you do have the intake manifold covering the other side to access the spark plugs. We've got a plastic valve cover here with an integrated exhaust manifold in the head. Now coming around the back side, you can see there's a big chunk of plastic here with that intake plenum and the plastic valve cover. In addition, we've got an EGR cooler and its valve situated over here. Now we don't exactly know what's wrong with this engine. The previous owner couldn't get it to start, but it does turn over, so we're going to tear it down to see what's inside. Alright, I'm going to start at the top here by removing the intake manifold. Let's remove the throttle body bracket and then the EGR. One thing I don't like is they switch to plastic vacuum hoses instead of rubber, and they snap off really easy. And this engine's not even that old. Alright, now I think I got all the wires out of the way. Lift off this air intake. And here they got this piece of foam. While taking off the intake, I kind of broke my wife's toothbrush. Anyways, as you can see underneath the intake manifold here, there's a lot of wires, and one thing I don't like is that you've got this wiring harness right here, so you can't pull the valve cover, nor can you pull the intake without taking off all these wires and all the clips that are attached to it. This is a port injected engine only, so you can see we've got our fuel injectors over here, and this here is a plastic fuel rail, which I really don't like, as well as a plastic crossover tube to the other side. We'll see why they have to use conduit all over the flexible fuel line over here. They could have just did a metal bar. Now I'm going to remove all the 8mm bolts that hold the lower intake manifold on. Good be able to get that off. And there's the lower intake manifold with the fuel rail. Now on the side here you can see we've got the EGR cooler, and what it does is it's going to take exhaust gases from the head over here before heading that back into the throttle body to get reburned. That's just part of emission standard nowadays. Remove a couple of 13s holding it on. Next I'm going to work on this valve cover. Stick the design of a big hunk of plastic holding all these wires here, and they're blocking the valve cover bolts. These modern engines have so many of these little clips that you have to take out in order to get the wiring harness off. Alright, so it took a while, but I got most of the wiring harness out of the way. Next thing I'm going to do is remove all the coil packs. Oh, come on, that one got stuck. That one's stuck too. Are they supposed to come off like this? Let's see if the passenger side's better. Nope. Okay, I don't know what's going on with that. Why would Chrysler use a 10mm for this sensor here? Whoa, that's juicy. That looks like an oil control valve for the variable valve timing system. And then they're going to use the Torx on this side here for the camshaft sensor. It's like they're pulling one out of a Volkswagen book. This engine has dual variable valve timing on both the intake and the exhaust, so we have to remove these actuators. Looks like a little plunger comes out when it actuates. Now we'll do the driver's side. Alright, I'm going to start by removing all the 8mm bolts to remove the valve cover on the driver's side. And here's your valve cover. I'm going to remove the valve cover on the passenger side. Now I can take off the valve cover. I like that the bolts are captive though. Taking a look under the valve cover of the Pentastar engine, here you can see you've got the intake and the exhaust camshaft. Now these camshafts don't directly act on a cam bucket that push down on the spring. Instead they have a little follower underneath there that has a roller, so it's kind of a roller arm, and that's going to push down on the valve. The advantage to that of course is that you've got this hydraulically adjustable roller arm here, so you don't have to do valve adjustments just as often. Now looking over here on the driver's side, everything here looks pretty intact. Even the timing chain here looks fairly taut, and it's fairly clean, which I bet it's probably a lower mileage engine being a 2018 model. However, when you come over here on the passenger side, you can see some carnage here where this engine ate this camshaft. Now if you zoom in here, you can see that this camshaft here has this ridge over here, and over here, and that's because that roller arm at the bottom there ate into this camshaft lobe. It's supposed to be completely flat like over on this side and not have that ridge. You can see on the rear cylinder here, you can see this ridge is just starting to form, though it's not as deep as that first cylinder. This is the front cylinder over here, and there's also a deep groove over here where the roller ate into it. Now this is going to cause low compression or loss of power because that valve can no longer open up and down properly because it's following a different cam profile. It's kind of sad that such a new engine died because of something really simple. They probably didn't have a good heat treatment process for these lobes. I'm probably going to make this the thumbnail shot of this video. Next up, I'm going to remove some of these accessories so we can get under the timing cover. One thing I don't like is that if you have to change an accessory belt on one of these, you got to remove the engine mount and the tensioner because it's kind of all trapped up and behind there. Kind of a stupid design. Alright, on the side of the engine here, I got to remove this engine mount. Alright, engine mount bracket. One is bigger than the other. Two different bolt sizes for the same part. Oh, there's a plastic pulley on there. What a good choice. I'm going to remove this 13. Another stupid plastic pulley. You can see they just pressed in a bearing into a piece of plastic. This is for the water pump. This idler bracket off here. Yes. And there's your idler bracket and the tensioner you can see there. And another plastic pulley. And I could finally peel off this belt. Remove this idler bracket. Alright, in front of the engine here you can see we've got part of the cooling system. We've got the radiator inlet down at the bottom here, the water pump over here, and then this piece here is part of the thermostat and coolant temperature sensor assembly. So there's a bunch of 10mm bolts holding this plastic housing on. And there you can see the thermostat. It gets replaced all as one unit. I'm going to remove all these 10mm bolts to hold the water pump on. Alright, here's the thermostat housing assembly. Kinda looks like a... Oh, no coolant. So I cheated and already took the crank bolt loose when the flywheel was on it before I mounted it on the stand. Holding the timing cover on looks like mostly 10mm bolts. Alright, we got a couple on the bottom here of the oil pan. And there's the timing cover. Taking a look at the timing setup on this Pentastar engine, here you can see we've got the crankshaft. That's going to directly drive the oil pump, which sits down in the sump below. We've also got a secondary chain that drives this idler pulley over here, which in turn is going to drive individual chains going to the camshaft. We've got 4 different timing chains here with 4 different tensioners. This is the spring-loaded one. The rest of them are all hydraulic. Kind of seems like overkill for just a V6 double overhead cam engine. Just going to start removing bolts until stuff flies off. Here we've got the slider. It's in pretty good condition. And I can take off this slider over here. This one's actually backed with metal, unlike a lot of other brands. Take off that chain. Work on this side here. See if I can get that chain off. Ooh, I'm going to remove this tensioner here. I'm going to take off the cam cap bolts. These are T30 Torx. I broke my bit. And I'm going to remove this camshaft here. And there's a close look at the groove that it made over there, there, and there. All 3 pistons had damage. Head bolts on these Pentastars are 15mm hex. Alright, now I should be able to remove the head. And here we've got the head gasket. I don't know if it's supposed to do that. Alright, now we're going to knock out the driver's side. Let's pull off the intake camshaft. I don't notice any grooves like the other side did. And the exhaust camshaft. Alright, now I'm going to knock off these 15mm head bolts. Alright, I should be able to get this head off now. I'm pulling off the head gasket here. This one looks pretty intact as well. The pistons themselves don't look as carved up, nor do they move around as much as the other side. Maybe there was definitely something wrong on that bank. Now the oil filter placement on Pentastars are very interesting to me. It seems like as soon as you unscrew this, you're going to make a big hot mess all over the engine, being a cartridge style filter upside down. Furthermore, I don't like how everything here is made of plastic, as well as the housing for the oil cooler, which has its coolant lines attached to it, as well as its location directly between the V, where the hottest part of the engine is going to heat cycle this plastic and cause it to crack. And it's not easy to get to this because you got to remove the intake plenum and manifold and a whole bunch of other stuff. These are E-Torx 8mm. Alright, and now I can pop this off, and you can see the oil and coolant passages that go into the engine here. And in between here we've got the knock sensors. Now I'm going to attempt to turn this engine over to work on the bottom. Got a bit of an oily mess down there. I got my wife's old bed sheet here from when we used to have a clean mattress. I'm going to sap that up. So here at the bottom we've got a steel oil pan and an aluminum upper oil pan. So I'm going to take that off with a bunch of 10 mils. Now I know it's cold out, but this oil pan has so much sludge inside. Oil is not supposed to look like that, but it doesn't appear to have been mixed with coolant. But that's really sludgy. My wife's not going to want this toothbrush back, you think? Now while the pistons have carbon in them, the camshafts are worn, and the oil pan has sludge, the oil pickup tube actually looks pretty clean. Bunch of 13mm bolts that hold the upper oil pan on. And there's the upper oil pan. You can see where the pickup tube supplies oil to this giant assembly here, which is actually the oil pump, and that's driven off of this timing chain from the crankshaft. A couple of 10mm bolts to remove the oil pump. Alright, this pump has a wire here. Just going to carefully disconnect that wire and remove the oil pump. Now here you can see the windage tray, and that's just there to help the oil kind of point down towards the middle of the oil pan as it's draining down. You've got these 13mm bolts that run along here that attach it, but they're also part of the main bearing. You can see here the main cap bearings have these 4 bolts here, as well as a couple of extra bolts holding it on the side. So each bearing here has 6 bolts holding it on. Let's see if I can run these 10 mils off. Yeah, they're on there pretty tight because they're part of the main bearing. I'll just crack these off. And there's the windage tray. So check it out, these connecting rod bolts are actually an 11mm socket. Never really used my 11mm yet. So surprisingly, all 6 connecting rod bearings are intact. They still have their original coating on them, and they barely show any signs of wear. I'm gonna peel off the rear main seal here. That's just the bolt-on unit. Alright, next up I'm gonna work on these main cap bolts. The 13mm ones that are cross-bolted on either side. These main bearings are actually a 16mm socket. This bearing is good. Now I can lift off the crankshaft. And now I can push these pistons through. Now take a look at the pistons that came out of this engine. This is the driver's side, which wasn't so bad. You can see here the oil control rings are pretty much clogged up with a lot of oil, and they're not going to allow oil to return back down. And because of that, that's why you have so much carbon buildup. All of these 3 pistons here more or less look the same. You can see there's just a lot of carbon buildup in all the rings. However, when we move to the passenger side, which is where we saw the damage on the camshaft, first of all, yes, they are a lot more carbon built up. You can see when I wipe that off, it's completely solid. And the other thing is these oil control rings are literally falling apart. If we move over to this piston here, it's the same thing. This oil control ring is also falling apart, and it's heavily carbon built up. Once you remove the bearing, all the coating here is also starting to come up. But the biggest one was this one, and I think this is the piston that was rocking back and forth. You can see here it's got a broken ringland, and that's this ridge here which is supposed to hold that oil control ring in. It just broke off over here, and that was probably causing that piston to slightly rock back and forth and wobble, making that knocking sound. So here we've got the engine all taken apart here. We're going to take a closer look at how it works before we get snowed in here. We're going to start here at the oil pan. As I mentioned before, this thing is completely sludged up. This is likely due to a lack of oil changes where the oil just breaks down. You mix this with a little bit of moisture over some time and you get this sludgy buildup. This is not very good at lubricating the engine and can also clog oil passages. Next up we have the oil pickup tube, which is going to draw some of that oil down into this oil pump. Now the oil pump is driven off of the crankshaft through this timing chain over here. We do have an electronic solenoid on this side here. We're going to try to open this up to see what's inside. We're just going to pop open this oil pump here. So here you can see we've got a vane style oil pump which is going to rotate over here, and that's going to create fluid flow and push that oil out to the output back into the block. Now this is a variable style oil pump where you've got this oil control valve which sat at the back here, and that's going to bring oil pressure through this little galley over here, and that's going to pressurize this chamber where you have the spring. Now this spring is going to compress, and that's going to control the amount of oil in this oil chamber over here before it exits out. So that way we've got an electronically controlled oil pump. Now that oil pump is going to then send oil down this oil galley over here, and there's a smaller one over on this side into the engine block, and if you follow the oil galley it's going to go up this way, then across, and then out to the center of the V where the oil filter is. And here you can see at the top of the V the oil is going to come in through the oil filter, get filtered out, and then cooled off, and then sent back down into the oil galley in the middle of the engine. This here is the oil filter and oil cooler assembly. Here you can see the two cooler inlets. Here you can see the two cooler inlets and outlets, and the two oil inlets and outlets. Let's see if we can take a look at this oil filter here. See if it caught any bearing material or anything. Alright, this uses a cartridge style oil filter. So if we take a look inside of here, I don't see any shiny bits or any small bits of metal in here. It doesn't look like there was any catastrophic failure in this engine. This being plastic is obviously a common failure point, and getting to it is a pretty difficult job because you got to take off the air intake and a bunch of other stuff. All of that oil from the oil filter and cooler assembly is going to be sent down this oil galley, which runs along the length of the engine here. Now that oil galley is going to run along the length of the engine here, and here you can see they've got taps where they put in oil sprayers to lubricate the inside of the cylinders of the engine. The main bearings here have this giant hole which is also going to tap into that main oil galley to lubricate the crankshaft and the connecting rod bearings. Of course, you also got these oil return holes here where the oil is going to come back down to that oil baffle, which is going to collect it in the oil pan. Finally, here at the back of the block you can see where the oil galley taps into the main galley for here, as well as here for these two ports here to feed the heads with oil. Now 3 of the tensioners are hydraulically controlled. Here you can see one tensioner has its galley that's going to feed it oil. The other tensioner located over here also is going to be tapping off through this hole over here to collect oil from there. So here we are taking a look underneath the passenger side head here. You can see there's actually 2 oil feeds, one over here and one at the front here, which is going to take oil into the head. Now a typical issue with these engines failing is that you're going to get a misfire in one of these cylinders, and that's because of that camshaft grinding down or a rocker arm that's misplaced and it's not opening or seating the valves properly. Furthermore, of course, you can have burnt valves, or even the valve seats here could be damaged. That's also causing a misfire. If you remember, the pistons were also carbed up. That's also due to the lack of oil changes on this engine. But when you do get a burnt valve or something that's misfiring, that's also going to throw a lot of oil in the engine. That's not just going to burn off through the exhaust. Now looking back at the top of the head here, as we saw earlier, we have a roller rocker arm system. Now these rocker arms here have an oil line here that runs along the length. You can see both for the intake and the exhaust side, and that has these hydraulic lifters inside. So here's what one of those hydraulic lifters look like. Basically, oil is going to go inside and fill it up like a cylinder, and that's going to cause this little plunger here to push up against the rocker arm, stop it from rattling around. Now sometimes these lifters can collapse, and you'll know that by them not being the same length or height when you take them out. And when they do collapse, they're going to cause a gap between this rocker arm here and the actual lifter itself. When they have a gap, it's going to cause a little bit of clunking around. In addition, these rocker arms also have little bearings in them, and that can also fail, causing this thing to move excessively, and that can also cause a ticking noise when your engine is running. Now, it's a very common issue on these Pentastar engines. You can see here just how this rocker arm has worn down, and that also caused that groove in the camshaft over there. That means that you have to change the camshaft and the rocker arm set on this engine in order to revive it, and that's a huge job because you got to deal with the timing side of the engine, the valve cover, and the air intake. Now the reason for that ticking sound, of course, is because this rocker arm is no longer fully seated on the full revolution of this camshaft here, as it loses contact and gains contact with the cam lobe while it rotates. And the telltale sign of that is a ticking when you start your engine, especially when it's cold in the morning. It's going to keep ticking, and of course it'll get louder if you keep ignoring it, and it'll cause engine damage eventually as it eats through this camshaft. Of course, I'm a little surprised that it's happening on this second generation version of the Pentastar engine, this being a 2018 motor. This is more of an issue on the 2011 to 14 models. In my opinion, this is probably a combination of both the geometry of the location of this rocker arm relative to where the lobe is and the valve's pivot point, in addition to the materials used here. They probably didn't harden this surface or the camshaft surface enough, and that causes excessive wear. with the very thin oil that they specified for fuel economy reasons. Here's one thing I really hate about modern engines. You got this stupid plastic little clips with the Christmas trees on them, and they plug into these little holes on the engine or engine block, and they're really difficult to get off, but they're also right up against a really hot surface, and that's going to cause them to become all crispy, and they'll just break when you take them out. In the old days, they'd make a bracket that hangs off here, and then you clip your wiring harness to that. That way it doesn't even get into your way when you have to work on the engine. I'm sure this is one of your pet peeves as well, the amount of plastic used in this engine. Now most intake plenums nowadays are a composite plastic. Of course you can't recycle this when the engine is over, but to have fuel rails that are made of plastic, I think that's stupid, because if they crack, which they can very easily, it can cause a fire. See if we can pop that off the injector. Look at that fuel coming out. Jeez, maybe I can cause a fire right here in the snow. Keep me warm. That is a lot of fuel. Now my wife's going to complain that she can smell gasoline when I go inside. This cheap old PA66 plastic. Even the injector bodies themselves are made of plastic too. Now at least this engine is still port injected, as it injects this gasoline here into the airstream just behind the valves there to keep things nice and clean. Newer engines obviously are direct injected, and then you don't get that nice clean valves. I guess they're still old school and using MAP sensors instead of MAP sensors right now. And up behind the intake here we've got the EGR valve. Just a simple valve that's going to open and close to let those stinky exhaust gases go back into your air intake and clog up your pistons. Look how stinky that is. It's all full of carbon and stuff too. And of course the EGR cooler itself is just a giant heat exchanger to cool off those exhaust gases. Now, I believe this little device here is a vacuum pump. Well, I opened up the cover here. You've got an electric motor on this side and a vacuum line exiting here and an electrical connector. Let's open this up and see what's inside. Whoa, looks like we got a vane style pump inside of here. We have the vanes over here, egg shape over here, and the air would be pushed by these vanes out this way so that it creates a suction. Looks like this little port over here is what pushed the air out, creating a suction over on this side. Now on older engines they would just power this with the camshaft so that you wouldn't have an electric motor or something extra to fail. And that's a look inside the Chrysler Pentastar series of engines and how it works. Now if you got one of these engines and you don't want it to fail, make sure you listen out for that ticking sound, use a heavier weight oil, and change it often. Also let me know in the comment section down below what do you think of the build of this engine, or if you have one of these, how it's holding up. Make sure you subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one.